All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome on in to the Auburn Daily Show, episode 17 of the Auburn Daily Show. Really excited to be here with you guys on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon here in Auburn, Alabama. Lance Dawe here with you, hanging out again for the 17th episode of the Auburn Daily Show. Got an exciting show for you guys today. Got a brief conversation with Zach Blackerby about some trap games later on in the show. We talked a little bit on yesterday's show about how there are a couple different contests I think that we should be looking at. We're also going to talk about how transfer portal quarterbacks fared in the offseason. And then we're also going to talk about 5 potential destinations for Walker Kessler in the NBA draft. Really exciting stuff. If you guys aren't already, go ahead and follow us over on our socials, SI_Auburn on Twitter. You can also follow us on Facebook as well. Live streaming every single day at 4 p.m. on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. Already see a couple of you in the chat. Trey Lee, what's going on, man? SL Hot Man, good afternoon. How you doing, man? We've got a lot of different things that we're going to talk about today. But first, I wanted to start off with transfer portal quarterbacks. Zach Blackerby, writer here at auburndaily.com, put out an article and briefly discussed how the transfer portal impacted the SEC last season. This is something that Zach said in the article. You can go check it out over at auburndaily.com. The quarterback position has been the most free agent-like position when it comes to football. This makes sense and shouldn't have come as a shock to those who have been following along. This offseason, Auburn brought in 2 quarterbacks from the transfer portal, Zach Calzada from A&M and Robbie Ashford from Oregon. Both are fighting for the starting job against TJ Finley, who started the last 3 games of last season after Bo Nix went down with an ankle injury. And then Zach asked the question in the article, how did first-year transfer quarterbacks perform in the SEC last season? So he and I actually went and looked through every single quarterback that started for an SEC team last year. We went and found the first-year transfers, and we collected their statistics just to see how they did. Consistently from here on out over at auburndaily.com, we're going to have an article with the stat of the day. It's going to be an interesting statistic, maybe something you didn't know about, maybe something that you did know about. We're just going to kind of dissect it and look at it from a couple of different angles. It's always going to be Auburn football related. But today, the stat of the day, it's talking about SEC quarterbacks. First-year transfer quarterbacks in the SEC last season were a combined 654 of 1,048 passing. So first-year transfer quarterbacks last season had an average completion percentage of 62%. And just in case you're wondering, the list is not terribly long. The group of quarterbacks from last season are Will Levis, Joe Milton, Hendon Hooker, TJ Finley, Jason Brown, and then Zeb Noland. 2 of those guys from South Carolina, 2 of those guys from Tennessee, 1 from Auburn, 1 from Kentucky. I think that one of the first things that we have to note here before diving into their individual statistics is that Hendon Hooker and Will Levis take up the majority of this stat pool, right? If we're talking about a combined 654 of 1,048 passing, well, Will Levis threw 353 of those passes, and Hendon Hooker threw 302, Both of those guys were the starters for, if not the majority of their season, for the entirety of it. And I think right off the bat, one of the questions I want to ask kind of to you guys and then kind of to myself is when you look at Will Levis and you look at Hendon Hooker, does Auburn have a guy on roster that could replicate their numbers? That's kind of what I want to start out with. So you look at Will Levis, he had a 66% completion percentage. Hendon Hooker had a 68.2% completion percentage. Both were very solid quarterbacks in their own right. Will Levis, a little bit more of a gambler, a little bit more turnover prone than Hendon Hooker, had 13 interceptions, which was the most in the SEC this past season. But I think that the question does Auburn have a quarterback on roster that could potentially come even close to the type of season that these guys had a year ago? I think you can't answer that question without looking at the entire picture. So take a step back with me just to look. Let's start with Hendon Hooker. Look at the surroundings at Tennessee that he had. Hendon Hooker had a couple of really, really good receivers that could stretch the field. Really, really talented guys at Tennessee last season. And that's kind of this style of offense that Tennessee liked to run. They really, really like to throw it around the yard, really, really like to be explosive. Cedric Tillman and Velus Jones Jr., and then also Javonta Payton were his three big play guys, but specifically Cedric Tillman and Velus Jones Jr., two guys that could go down and stretch the field. That's what Tennessee had. They also had arguably a little bit better of an offensive line than Auburn, but that's neither here or there in this scenario. But point being, the surroundings at Tennessee, I think, are not drastically different than what Auburn has personnel-wise, but it's different. I would argue that it's better than what Auburn had and has currently in the receiver room, and then also if you want to throw the offensive line in there as well. Will Levis, really, really good offensive line. As far as a complete receiver core, I don't know necessarily if he had one. He had a couple of guys that were really experienced, but the primary weapon that Will Levis had was Wan'Dale Robinson, one of the best receivers not only in the SEC, but also in the entire country. He was the safety valve, the primary guy. If Kentucky needed to get out of a jam, they would look to Wan'Dale Robinson. You got to see that in the bowl game against Iowa. When they had to go down and score a touchdown, they looked his way over and over and over and over again. And whenever I say that, I literally mean on like 4 or 5 pass plays in a row. So Hendon Hooker had a couple of guys that were explosive down the field, and Will Levis just had an all-around guy that he could go to. I don't think, looking at Auburn's receiving core on paper, that they have a guy that could stretch the field for one, or could be a huge target for them in all areas of the field and rack up a ton of catches and eclipse 1,000 yards or get close to it. And I think part of that, we're going to see that play out. Part of it because of the scheme that Brian Harsin likes to run, and then also part of it is because I don't think Auburn just has that type of personnel. They're going to spread the ball around this season. Auburn is. They're going to get it to a bunch of different guys. I just don't think any of them are particularly explosive or good at one thing or another, right? Malcolm Johnson Jr., I think he's got speed, but he lacks a little bit of height if you're asking for a consistent deep threat. He's also dropped a couple of passes whenever he's been given the opportunity. Javarius Johnson, we've gotten to see him sparingly. I think he could be somebody that could emerge as a Wan'Dale Robinson type, but certainly not Wan'Dale Robinson. I think you look at Shedrick Jackson, really physical receiver, not the best hands, still working on that, heading into what feels like his 14th year on the Plains here. So Auburn's got prospects in their receiver room, and then add Ike Hilliard to the equation. It's like, well, you should see some development, right? But again, I don't think that Auburn is dealing with what Will Levis and Hendon Hooker did. And then also, I mentioned it for a second, just talking about scheme, Auburn's not going to be taking a ton of shots downfield. They're not going to be able to rack up these passing yards or passing touchdowns, I don't think. But I'll tell you what Auburn probably is going to have the opportunity to do. And I don't necessarily know if this is dependent on signal caller. It might be. So Will Levis and Hendon Hooker both had completion percentages over 66%. But you look at the 4 other guys that were first-year transfer quarterbacks in the SEC. Joe Milton had a 51.6% completion percentage. TJ Finley, 54.7%. Jason Brown, 55.6%. And then Zeb Noland, 55.8%. All 4 of those guys underneath 56% completion percentage. What I think that Auburn's quarterback is going to be able to do this season based off of scheme and based off of personnel is they may not be explosive. We talked about this before on the show. I don't necessarily know if they need to be explosive. But instead of being explosive, I think they're going to be efficient. I think the scheme is going to give Auburn the opportunity to be that. Whether that be Zach Calzada, whether that be Robbie Ashford, or whether that be TJ Finley, or somehow Holden Garner. The short to intermediate passing game is what Brian Harsin, I think, is going to try and incorporate in this pro style offense, this West Coast type of offense. If they're not running the ball, they're probably taking some easy completions, right? And I'm not saying easy as if like it's a bad thing. I think Auburn's just going to try and be efficient in the way that they operate, especially given their personnel. The offensive line's not absolutely fantastic. They don't have somebody that can blow the top off of a defense consistently. So I think Auburn's going to do a really good job of completing throws and getting some 15 to 10-yard chunk plays, not necessarily 30 or 40, but getting those little chunk plays in the middle of the field. And I think they're going to be able to jack up their quarterback completion percentage through that. Now, we've seen TJ Finley struggle, obviously, like I just mentioned, underneath 55% with his completion percentage last year. Also, something I want to note, he had the second highest uncatchable ball rate behind Mike Wright of Vanderbilt in the SEC last season, which is not good. But on the flip side of that, he wasn't really set up to succeed, wasn't really put in a good position. And on top of that, he's been working on his accuracy this spring. Now, how high is his ceiling? And whenever he's playing his best game, I don't know. But TJ Finley, I think, given an opportunity to play in this system, could work his way up to 62%, which was the average for first-year transfer quarterbacks last season. Zach Calzada, I think, would have the opportunity to do so as well. Of course, you have to note this. If you, as an Auburn fan, were in the camp that Bo Nix threw the football just a little bit too hard on just about every throw that he had, then I don't think Zach Calzada is the quarterback for you. If you go and watch some of his film, and I'd like to direct you specifically, I believe, to his South Carolina film. Texas A&M had quite a few dump-offs, especially early in that game, if you want to go check it out. And the receivers were either unable to collect the pass, or it was really difficult for them to do so in the flat because Zach Calzada was putting everything he had on that ball. And sometimes he would like intentionally do it. Sometimes it just happens. That's just the way Zach Calzada throws the football, throws it really, really hard. I think that's why he was a good downfield passer for A&M, at least at times last season. You put Robbie Ashford or Holden Garner in this type of scheme, I think their completion percentage is really high. I just don't know what the upside for the offense is. Ashford does really intrigue me, though, after seeing what he did during A-Day. And there was one throw where he was rolling out to his right. I believe it was Tavares Dawson that could have broken free. It was a broken play, and Robbie just laid it out there. Unfortunately, I believe it was about 5 or 6 yards past Tavares and 1 or 2 yards to his right. But if he could get throws like that down, I think Auburn's offense can become efficient and then at the same time explosive. I think Robbie Ashford gives Auburn the best opportunity to do that based on what I've seen. I could be completely wrong, but that's just based off what I've seen. So again, just to kind of recap here, there were 2 quarterbacks, first-year transfers in the SEC last season that kind of accumulated most of these stats. And both of them were efficient in their own right. One more turnover prone than the other, but both were good. And then the 4 others just kind of didn't pan out. And they were also working in odd situations. At least 3 of them were. Joe Milton was just not good at Tennessee. But TJ Finley was in a bad spot. Jason Brown was in a bad spot. And then Zeb Noland was a literal grad transfer that did not intend on playing at all. And based on South Carolina's quarterback situation, they had to make an adjustment. Austin Price in the chat says, I don't think Auburn quarterbacks this year will be able to pull off what the other quarterbacks did last year because of the inexperience and unknowns at receiver. I can get behind that, and that's kind of what I was saying a second ago, is that Auburn's got a lot of second-year guys that haven't really had the opportunity to develop in the system. You've got Ike Hilliard, and I'm really, really excited to see what he does for the Tigers this year. But outside of him, and the confidence that I have in him, I mean, I'm excited about Tavares Dawson. I'm excited about Malcolm Johnson Jr., Javarius Johnson, looking at maybe Camden Brown and Amari Kelly getting a couple of touches this year just to see what they look like down the road. And then obviously the tight end room, I think, is solid. But will Auburn be able to pull off what Hendon Hooker did or Will Levis did last season? I don't think so. And also, I don't know if the scheme may limit them. And I'm not saying that the scheme is negative. The scheme can work. Short to intermediate passing game can certainly work. not everything has to be flashy, but I don't think Auburn's set up in a position, after looking at this stat of the day here, they're not set up in a position to be like Hooker or Levis. But I'll say this, they have also put themselves in a position to be unlike Finley last year, Jason Brown, Zeb Nolan, and Joe Milton. There's a middle ground there. Now, what that equates to in terms of wins, I couldn't tell you. Because while there were moments last year where quarterback play certainly would have aided Auburn, especially late, you need a lot of different things going your way. You need your offensive line to be clicking. You need your defense to be able to create some havoc and kind of be able to get off the field, unlike Auburn was last year at times. So yeah, that's where I stand on the statistic of the day regarding first-year transfer quarterbacks in the SEC. All right, in just a second, I want to get to 5 potential landing spots for Walker Kessler. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends at AU Shirts. AU Shirts is the new place to visit to flex your fandom. AUshirts.com. It's the one-stop shop for Auburn fans being able to display their Auburn sports fandom for every major sport here on the Plains. The newest shirt at AUshirts.com is actually a shirt design for Brody Moore, Auburn baseball player. They've also got another design from Auburn first baseman Sonny DeShera with the affectionate title "Thick King" on the shirt. It's a really cool design. You can also find shirts ranging from everything school design to celebrating the Cruton Finger, portal season, and other official player designs. They'll all be coming soon. AU Shirts is giving Auburn Daily viewers 10% off their order. All you have to do is use promo code DAILY at checkout. Again, that's AUshirts.com, promo code DAILY for 10% off your order. Would highly encourage you guys to go check them out. I will leave the website in the description below after we go off air. Again, use code DAILY, 10% off your order. Got some dope designs. If you want to support the Tigers and you want to maybe support some of these athletes, especially for the baseball team, check them out. All right. Moving along here to 5 potential landing spots for Walker Kessler. Trey Lee, Auburn Shirts has some dope designs. I 100% agree. Whoever did those designs is goated, Trey. I wonder who pulled those off. They look super dope. They look super dope. The 5 best destinations for Walker Kessler. This was written by Gray Oldenburg over at auburndaily.com. If you want to go check it out, again, auburndaily.com. Something that Gray immediately notes is that Walker Kessler will offer a defensive presence that several NBA teams will be searching for in the NBA draft. Some teams are probably looking for some paint presence, and I think Kessler could be a really, really good fit for a lot of different schools. So let's go over the 5 landing spots potentially for the 7'1" center out of Auburn. Starting here at the top, Gray says that the Milwaukee Bucks could potentially be a really, really good landing spot for the Walker Kessler. And I think that this personally would be incredibly exciting for one primary reason, and that's Kessler getting to potentially play with Giannis, which would be super, super awesome. And this is something interesting that I didn't know that Gray notes in the article. Milwaukee is currently sitting 27th in the NBA in blocks per game due to their only defensive big presence being former Defensive Player of the Year Giannis Antetokounmpo. Getting another big to back up Brook Lopez should be extremely high on their radar. Drafting a big guy will also give them the ability to move Bobby Portis back to his more natural position and let him play power forward. I think that's a great stat there from Gray, just to kind of give the sales pitch. It's like, hey, you could use Kessler in Milwaukee. Of course, one of the things, and this is not to knock on Trey. This is kind of to more knock on the game, the NBA game, and just kind of really think about what is Walker Kessler capable of in the NBA. The way fouls are called in the league, I think it's probably going to be a little bit different than the way things were called in college. And so I'm curious to see, will Kessler have to adjust at all? Can that continue to be his calling card? I think that's going to be an interesting question. Another team here, the Miami Heat. And this is something that Gray noted. He noted that the Milwaukee Bucks were not good at total blocks per game. Milwaukee's actually last in the NBA with only 3.2 blocks per game as a team, which is shocking.
And Oldenburg notes that's largely due to the fact that Miami is a very guard and wing-centered team, and outside of Bam Adebayo, who is a good defensive presence, they have no true centers on the current roster. Kessler would make an immediate impact in South Beach with his length and rebounding ability, but also being able to sit behind Adebayo, whose outside game is as best as any big man in the league, be able to learn from him. I'm not the biggest Miami fan, but I think that it would be a really good, all things considered, I think Gray makes a really good point here. Miami would be a good spot for him to land if we're just talking about potential as a backup. I think him and Bam Adebayo, they would form a pretty strong paint presence. Third team here, the Portland Trail Blazers, a team that has done absolutely nothing to help Damian Lillard during his time in Portland. The Trail Blazers were 27th in the league in rebounding and also in the bottom half of the NBA in blocks per game. Portland has no centers currently contracted for the 2022-23 season. They will try and extend Yusuf Nurkic this offseason, but allowing Walker Kessler to come off the bench while still helping Portland in their biggest area of concern would be great. Something that Gray noted in the article, and another team that is in need of a post presence. I'm surprised that there are this many teams out there. We've gone through 3 that they legitimately need a backup guy. And I think that Miami, looking through these 3 so far, I think Miami's the most compelling argument. But I think you could definitely see him going to any of these 3 programs. The fourth here, the Charlotte Hornets. The Charlotte Hornets have not won a playoff series since 2002 and coming off back-to-back years where they've gotten blown out in the new play-in tournament. Outside of the previous struggles from Charlotte, they are a very young and talented guard-heavy team led by upcoming star LaMelo Ball. But the lack of a big guy presence in Charlotte and the only true center being Mason Plumlee, it has left the owner of the Hornets, Michael Jordan, intrigued with big guys like Kessler in the draft this year. That's what Gray Oldenburg noted about the Charlotte Hornets. Another place where Walker Kessler could end up and also be awesome because he could pair with JT Thor. I would be all for that. And then the final piece here, or final team here, the Chicago Bulls. I'd be excited about this. Not a huge Bulls fan, but I think this would be fun. So the Bulls went 46-36 on the year. And they are the 6th seed in the Eastern Conference, probably about to get their stuff ran in the playoffs, unfortunately. But they were 28th in rebounding, 27th in blocks, and those are 2 areas that Walker Kessler could significantly impact coming off the bench for Chicago. I think that this would be an interesting spot for Kessler to land. This is what Gray says in the article. The finish to the NBA playoffs and the NBA draft lottery set on May 17th will tell us a lot more about where Kessler might end up. The possibility of having 2 first-round picks from Auburn in the same draft for the first time ever is going to be something very, very special to see. That's what Gray notes in the article. Personally, I think after going through that list, I think Miami probably makes the most sense. I'd like to see him in Milwaukee. I'd like to see him in Charlotte. I'd like to see him in Chicago. A lot of places that I actually would be pretty pleased with Walker Kessler ending up going. If you're watching this after we've finished the live stream, if you want to leave a comment below as where you would like to see Walker Kessler go, leave it in the YouTube comments, man. And if you're watching right now, if you've got a thought, let me know. All right. I think that's all before we get to our conversation with Zach Blackerby. So I had a conversation with Zach on the Locked On Auburn podcast. Episode's going to be going up tomorrow on the Locked On Auburn podcast. If you want to go check him out, would highly encourage you to do so if you haven't already. Had a conversation about 3 potential trap games for the Auburn Tigers this season. Now, yesterday, I kind of went over this at the end of the episode, but I did a little bit more research and I put some notes together and had a discussion with Zach on 3 potential spots or 3 potential games where Auburn could struggle, even though they probably shouldn't. So here, let's go ahead and kick it to our conversation with Zach Blackerby. Here is the king himself.
All right, Lance, you put up a piece at auburndaily.com yesterday about the 3 trap games to watch. Kind of take us through that, if you will.
Yeah, so let's start at the beginning of the schedule. So I've got 3 different games here. 2 of them are Power 5 opponents. One of them's a group of 5 school. We'll get to that later because it is later in the schedule. But let's start here with Missouri. It's September 23rd, 4th game of the season. In my opinion, I think this is the most reasonable contest to pin as a trap game. I think it's got the most potential because if you're looking on the surface, when you look at all these preseason magazines and predictions and what Vegas is saying, Auburn's not going to be favored in a lot of games. Quite frankly, a lot of people don't think Auburn's going to a bowl. So you have to kind of look at some of the surefire wins, maybe in conference play, surefire wins in non-conference play, and say, okay, which one of these could be iffy? I think Missouri is one of those games where if Auburn's going to go 5-7, most people, including fans, would just assume, oh, that's a game Auburn should catch a dub in, right? They should be able to go in at home and beat Missouri, a team that they're arguably, I would say, significantly more talented than. But you start to really dig into it. I mean, both these teams are coming off 6 and 7 seasons. Both of them have turmoil at the quarterback position. And what Missouri has done is gone out and gotten Jaden Daniels, transfer from Arizona State. 35-13 touchdown interception ratio. Was like 10 picks to 10 INTs last year at Arizona State, but he's got promise as a quarterback, right? And I think Missouri, with the loss of Tyler Beatty, their bell cow running back, they're going to have to throw the ball a little bit more. They've got a couple of really talented receivers. Mookie Cooper, transfer from Ohio State. Luther Burden, 5-star receiver in their recruiting cycle this year. If they have to throw the ball a little bit more, and this is just speculation, this is not definitive. If they have to throw the ball a little bit more, what does Auburn's secondary look like if they can't generate a consistent pass rush? Got to see it against Penn State, got to see it against Mississippi State, right? That's just my concern, is that maybe Auburn has a little bit of scheme issue early on in the year, and they're still working the kinks out. They've just played Penn State. They're coming off of a tough game. What does Auburn's defense look like? Can they get Missouri off the field on 3rd down whenever they need to? Or will this efficient passing game that Missouri could potentially have, again, nothing's definitive, could potentially have, does it give Auburn problems? Also, what does Auburn's quarterback position look like 4 weeks into the season? Maybe Auburn struggles against Penn State and they've got to rework things, right? So this is just a potential trap game. I'm not saying that it's definitive, but it's a possibility on their schedule. Zach, what do you think about that?
I think it's interesting. I mean, your arguments make sense. The fact that it's in Jordan-Hare Stadium makes it less trap gamey to me. When I think trap game, and there's no perfect definition of a trap game, but just the first thing that comes to mind is when a team is favored by 14 points going on the road. That's kind of what I think a trap game. And I think Auburn will be favored against Missouri, and obviously it's at home. So it would be bad. Like, people will call for Brian Harsin's job if Auburn loses that game.
Right. And my thing is, like, if you look at Auburn's schedule, there's not going to be a lot of road games that Auburn's favored in this season. I mean, they have to go on the road to Mississippi State and Ole Miss. They've got to go on the road to Alabama, to Georgia. There's just not a lot of opportunity for Auburn to go into a road environment and say, we can take control of this game and win it fairly easily. So for me, when doing this, I had to look at some of the home games, and Missouri was the first one. The second one here was Arkansas. This is October 28th. And some people may hear that and immediately think about, well, Arkansas went 9-4 last season. They were a top 25 team. They're going to be a preseason top 25 team this year. And you're right. I think they're going to be a good team. But here's the thing. Arkansas only brings back 9 combined starters, 6 on offense, 3 on defense. What does that look like under Sam Pittman, who is still trying to get the program on its feet in terms of recruiting? Curious to see what that looks like. Also, Arkansas is really struggling at receiver, so it may take them some time to really pan some of those guys out. And you look at their schedule, incredibly difficult. In the first half of the schedule, they play Cincinnati, South Carolina, A&M, and Alabama. And then before they play Auburn, they go on the road to Mississippi State and BYU, which is so weird that they're playing BYU right in the middle of the season, but it's whatever. Yeah. But the point being, there's a realistic chance Arkansas could be somewhere between 4-3 and 2-5 by the time they play Auburn, depending on how bad things get. And so what I'm saying is, while Arkansas may have a bad record, or they may be under 500, or they may be struggling, they're still a really talented football team. And it could catch Auburn by surprise, considering that this game is in between road trips to Mississippi State and Ole Miss, right? They may be looking ahead if Ole Miss is a really good team, which I don't think is a characteristic of a Brian Harsin team. But if we're just talking about potential trap games here, I think it's fair to assume that that's a possibility. But this Arkansas team, I think, is going to be better than what their record indicates. I don't believe the saying that you are what your record says you are. I think 9-4 for Arkansas last season could have probably been 11-1, 12-0 in the Pac-12, right? 11-1 in the Big 12, right? So I just think that this is going to be
a little bit last year too. Like
they
even in
did.
the SEC, like were they 9-4 good, or were they like? I mean, just watching them, especially when Auburn played them, like probably more like a 7-5 team.
Some things did bounce their way. I'll say that, and I think that's even more reason
that
to
happens.
believe that
There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah,
right. I think that there's even more reason to believe that they could take a slide. Like ESPN's FPI, which is always on something, whatever it is, I want to have some of it, but they project ESPN's FPI, or excuse me, ESPN thinks that Arkansas will go 6-6 or 7-5 this season. It's like 6.5, 5.5. So it could be one of those games where it's just like, okay, Auburn is somehow like what? 7-2, 7-3, 6-3, something like that. And they're heading into this game expected to win it. They're favored by 8.5 points. And all of a sudden, on an 11 a.m. game on the SEC network, Arkansas's offense explodes and Auburn doesn't have enough firepower to catch back up. It's like this game gives me 2021 Mississippi State vibes. I don't know why, it just does.
I get it. Yeah, I mean, I think Auburn beats Arkansas this year, and I think they beat Missouri. So I think you putting them as trap games makes sense. What's your third one?
And I'll say this. I don't think that the way you go about trying to peg trap games, at least in my opinion, is looking at the games that Auburn should win, right? And even some of the games at home, that Mississippi State game has scarred me permanently. So I will forever be looking at the games at home and just be like, okay, which team has a really good passing attack? Because I'm really, really scared about that. And this final team, actually, speaking of passing attack, had a really, really good one last year. It was actually the best in the country. Western Kentucky. Now, the Hilltoppers don't bring back a ton of production on the offensive side of the ball. They lost their really talented quarterback. They lost a couple of their receivers, but they've still got a lot of talent on roster. And their unit last season averaged 44.2 points per game. That was second nationally. Their passing attack, first in the country, averaged 443 passing yards per game. They're still going to be relatively lethal. Okay. And this goes back to what I was saying about Missouri is Auburn struggled against Mississippi State's air raid last season, right? What happens when this defense faces an efficient passing attack, right? That's just my concern. And you may say, well, Auburn's defense could have that figured out by the end of the season. Yeah, well, they didn't against Mississippi State last year. And so the concern there, I think, is legitimate. Now, should Auburn win this game by 40? Probably. But if things fall off the rails for Auburn this season, right, and they are definitely out of bowl contention and things have just kind of gone wrong, does Auburn get up for a game against Western Kentucky in between games against Texas A&M and Alabama? Right?
No.
I
in that world, no, that doesn't happen. Yeah.
And so I think that there is concern. There would be legitimate concern in that scenario. I think that's why it's a potential trap game.
Interesting. That's good. It's good to think about. And I think you lay out good points. And I'm with you. That Mississippi State game from last year is just like, it was, I asked several folks that have come on over the last few weeks, what, like if you had to pick 3 games that Auburn would win in SEC, like which 3 are you most comfortable with? And Justin Ferguson said Mississippi State was one of his. And I'm like, I just can't get there. Get there based on what happened last year. So I'm right there with you.
There's our conversation with Zach Blackerby about 3 potential trap games in the 2022 season for Auburn football. I want to make a quick note here because I'm a moron. Jaden Daniels is not at Missouri. He is at LSU. I may be stupid. All right. Anyway. All right. That's going to do it for today's episode of the Auburn Daily Show. Actually, to kind of recap the Missouri point, though, they've got a quarterback battle going on. 2 of them pocket passing guys that I would probably have a little bit of faith in. Brady Cook, Tyler Macon, and then also Sam Horn, freshman. He's going to be in the mix there as well. Point being is, like, do I think Auburn wins all 3 of those games? Yes. I think that they will be favored somewhere between 7 to 14 points in all of those contests. Actually, probably it's going to be a lot more for Western Kentucky. It's just that it's a potential trap game, and the point is it's the games you don't expect. So that was kind of my point there with the Missouri Tigers. All right, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Auburn Daily Show. If you're not following us on social media, you can follow us on Twitter at SI_Auburn. You can also follow us on Facebook. Just search Auburn Daily, and you can check out all of our content over at auburndaily.com. Lindsey Crosby, host of the Locked On MLB Prospects podcast, and also writer over at auburndaily.com, putting out a lot of really good baseball content. Again, like I mentioned earlier, stat of the day, it's going to continue to come out every single day here on Auburn Daily. It's going to be interesting. Every single day, it's going to be a new stat. Probably going to talk about it consistently here on the show. There's an Auburn baseball game tonight, I believe against Kennesaw State. You guys should all go check that out. And you should check out Lindsey Crosby's recap over at auburndaily.com as well. All right. Hope you guys have a great rest of your afternoon, and God bless.